Fantastic. So thank you all for being here. I know some of you responded to stuff that Wes posted. Some of you responded to some things I posted, and some of you just have maybe an unhealthy obsession with the wine world and want to be here. So we appreciate all of you and are thrilled that you are here. Wes, we were talking just a little bit before everybody got here. You and I met online, which is fun, kind of like in a pre-dating world. We are maybe that's how we first got together.
We actually met online before meeting online was a thing.
Yeah.
We met online on the Prodigy wine board. And I mean, I can see my friend Joseph, who is about as tech savvy as they come. He probably remembers the Prodigy wine board, but that really was the first place you could actually go in the 90s and actually have conversations with other human beings. I mean, IRC and Prodigy, but I remember, yeah, that Robert Parker was on Prodigy, and I remember a couple of other people would go back and forth with Robert Parker about the fact that he didn't know what Brett smelled like, and it was a big thing, man. It was loads of fun, man. That was what. So that would have been what, 97, 98?
Yes, 97. So you were just in the process of planting Clos Pepe.
Yeah, Chardonnay was planted, Pinot Noir was getting ready to be planted, and the Santa Rita Hills, I had already worked for Brian Babcock in 96, at which time Brian Babcock looked out a window and pointed and said, "This is not the western end of the Santa Ynez Valley, West. This is the Santa Rita Hills." And that was the first time I'd ever heard in 1997 the term Santa Rita Hills, because the Santa Rita School, or the foundation of the Santa Rita School, was at the bottom of the Babcock property. And that was the beginning of talking about, we have to stop letting other people define Santa Barbara County and the smaller AVAs that were important. And that was the moment that really launched my sort of career as an AVA petitioner and someone who would have some small part in the history of where and what Santa Barbara County can do.
Well, and you had a very big part in my own history in that I wouldn't have come down to the Santa Rita Hills. I mean, maybe I would have eventually, because God knows with Siduri, I ended up going everywhere. But you were the person, and I got to say, your energy, your enthusiasm was infectious at the time. And I mean, the Prodigy Wine Bulletin Board, there were none of these pictures. There was none of this beautiful. I mean, these were all just words. And you conveyed this excitement for what you were doing in the vineyard that it made me think, I mean, maybe not intelligently, but it made me think, my God, I'm already in Oregon all the way down to Santa Lucia, but that's not enough. I need to go 3 more hours south to get more grapes. And I came down and walked the property with you, and I'm like, yeah, I got to do this.
Yeah, there were some special wines already kind of poking out of there. I mean, ever since the 76 Sanford and Benedict, and Dan Berger wrote about it in the LA Times. That article, I just found out, was read at Fresno, and a guy read that article, and his name was Byron Ken Brown. And Mr. Ken Brown would never have come to Santa Barbara County if they were not talking about that Sanford and Benedict Pinot Noir in 76. So it was Dan Berger who probably gave us Ken Brown. Ken Brown, of course, gave us Santa Barbara County Pinot Noir and the University of Zaca Mesa, which launched the winemaking careers of just about everyone you could name, famous winemakers out of Santa Barbara. So, and I think as far as my enthusiasm goes, it can probably be traced back to the fact that I had retired from a very lucrative career in public education. And if I did not make this damn thing go, if I didn't make Clos Pepe go, my parents, Steve and Kathy, would be, out of all the money that they put into that dirt. But B, I'd have to go back to teaching high school. So thank you for keeping me. It's much more interesting being soaked with wine than it is being, around unruly teenagers in the 90s and 2000s.
Well, and then I think for many years thereafter, after 2000 crop, at least for Pinot, was 99 the first crop for Chard?
98 Chardonnay, 2000 for Pinot, although we harvested about 2 tons of Pinot Noir off a few more vigorous vines. I made 1 barrel of sort of home Pinot Noir in 99 to sort of get my yips out before my wife and I went pro.
Yeah. I think over the years between you and me and a multitude of other people that you ended up selling grapes to, we ended up with some wines that were really pretty fantastic over time.
My secret to Clopepi was I put together a prospectus of what we wanted to do, how we wanted to farm, our perspective, our great love for all things Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And I went to the Vintners Festival and I went up to Greg Brewer and I gave Greg Brewer and I said, if you want the fruit out of Clopepi, we'll sell it to you at county average for the first 3 years, but you have to vineyard designate it if the quality is consummate, what you believe justifies the vineyard designation. Did the same thing with Brian Babcock, did the same thing with Rick Longoria, did the same thing with Jim Clendenin. So we absolutely, and with you and with Loring, that we've cherry picked our producers to carry the message of vineyard designation into the market. It's almost impossible to do now. It's almost as hard to make a vineyard famous as it is a brewery famous. I mean, how good does your beer need to be that you actually get a reputation these days, like Russian River, Hen House, Alvarado Street, Trillium Treehouse, Toppling Goliath? The brands are set, and that's one thing we're going to probably talk about today, is just how hard it is to basically set yourself up for success in the high end of the wine business in the United States today.
So that is true. Like over the last 25 years, we've gone through a lot of wonderful, incredible times. And we were talking also right before people came on. In some ways, you could make the argument that times have never been better than they are today. Antonio Galani came out with his Santa Barbara report, and Jeb Dunnett came out with his Santa Barbara report. Both of them over 600 wines, so 1,200, 1,400, some level like that of reviews today on Santa Barbara wines, with the vast, vast majority of them being fantastic. So you could make the argument from the outside that times have never been better, but we also know that times are difficult in the wine business right now too.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, we can probably start talking a little bit about grapes and basically vineyard acreage and tonnage pricing. I think this year we're going to see a lot of, right in the next 6 weeks, we're going to see some crazy prices dropping on the spot market. I know that there's probably hundreds of tons of Cabernet in Paso that's still looking for a home. Hundreds of tons of Zinfandel in Paso looking for a home. So I mean, you might be locked in at really great prices right now, $1,200 to $2,000 a ton. But I suspect in the next few weeks we're going to start hearing some stuff out of places that have more commercial production, where grape tonnage pricing is just going to basically fall to, if you pick it, we'll give it to you. So I mean, vineyard acreage, especially in Santa Barbara County, some of my favorite vineyards. It just breaks my heart driving by and seeing these vineyards, yanked out. We just lost Solomon Hills Vineyard, which was absolutely mind-numbingly difficult for me to see because it's right across the street from my house. Seeing those vines get ripped up is just like, it's so visceral. I can actually feel it, like my guts being ripped out a little bit too, especially a vineyard that produced Chardonnay that was just that beautiful. But obviously I have my sort of finger on the pulse a little bit more of Santa Rita Hills, Santa Maria Valley. You probably have a little bit more sort of in the North Coast. What are you seeing up there as far as
you're seeing vineyards being ripped out, or at least being worked in a way that they're not going to be farmed this year in any way, shape, or I mean, they're waiting at least a year to see that. I for a while thought, okay, this is going to be a Central Valley phenomena. We're going to see, and we have over the years seen the Central Valley move from different crops, and that seems to be something that happens more frequently there. And I was trying to figure out, are we going to see it in more premium, truly coastal areas or not? And I think it's apparent that we are, that in Santa Barbara and parts of Sonoma County, I think Napa still seems to be doing okay, but I think there is fruit available. You can get good fruit available, but say you're in the Pope Valley part of Napa, not in the main valley, that's a different world and not a particularly great one either. Monterey County, San Lucia Highlands, there's a large amount of fruit available. I think, I mean, you're talking about down in Santa Barbara, I know Sierra Madre, a lot of it's being planted to strawberries
Mm.
and other, other crops as well. So I think it's across the state, even in the premium growing areas.
And I mean, the truth is the most difficult part of being a grower and a winemaker is the crystal ball, right? Because we have to, everything that happens in the vineyard happens basically in 2-year cycles. The crop for next year is already set in the vines this year by virtue of fruit bud differentiation and fruitfulness that occurred during spring growth. But the most, and you think trying to understand what your crop is next year by virtue of sun exposure last year, that's frightening, that requires some prescience. Think about this. We are making decisions today about what the market is going to look like 5 years from now. Because what are we planting? What are we grafting? What are we prepping for? How many barrels are we going to sign up for? What vines are we going to order? What clonal combinations of variety and clone or accessions or, whatever you want to call it, cultivars and clone combination. Everything in the vineyard, it happens in 2-year cycles, and everything in the market happens in 5-year cycles. So the decisions to pull out the vineyards right now are anticipating that this slight turn down that no one in the wine industry talks about. I think we invited you guys here today to talk about the truth in wine, and you're not going to see a lot of people talking about seeing vineyards pulled up because we want to be Pollyannish, we want to be sort of a little bit more optimistic about this stuff. And but to be honest, what I hear when we get together is people are struggling. They have inventory. The fruit is not selling for the same price as it was. The wines, we're seeing some pushback, and of course, now if we go into another oversupply situation, we're going to see the imports just take us for lunch, because imports, we're one of the only wine producing countries that does not subsidize our wine industry. Portugal, France, Italy, Spain, 2 to 5 euros a bottle.
Yeah.
And here we are trying to sell by the glass wines where you can get a good bottle of Vino Verde for $5. We can't buy the packaging for $5.
No,
So,
and there are things where you will see, like Muscadet, they turn around, and to help an oversupply in the market, the government buys it and turns it into some sort of distilling liquor or some other
or
thing
fuel.
in fuel. Yeah, and they will turn around and make that choice to help the oversupply situation correct itself quickly. Wes, when I realized that we were kind of in difficulty was in 2020 vintage, where we lost. I know Santa Barbara did not suffer through smoke and all of that, but a large part, some of Paso did, but really Monterey all the way up lost their fruit, and it didn't put us into a extreme shortage situation. It put us into almost a balanced situation, with which 2021 then all of a sudden put us back into an oversupply. And then 2022 was a small crop, and we're oversupplied. So when you have these big disruptions that should put you in a situation where we have much more demand than there is supply, and it didn't do that, that's when I was like, okay, this is different.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I'm seeing that some folks are asking about consumer behavior or climate change. And I'm not trying to steal Moray's thunder, because I know she's watching the questions, but I think that's a pretty good idea. I think it's both, obviously. When I look back at what Burgundy was when I was growing up and tasting Burgundy in my 20s and 30s, and I'm talking now, like, I am 55 years old, but I don't feel like I understand the wine business from a perspective like an Antonio Gardella. But from that perspective, I go back and I taste Village wines now, and they have flesh. They're actually ripened out. And I think we're going to have a guy named like Andrew Jeffords go through and rewrite the history of Burgundian villages, because Nuit Saint George is not Nuit Saint George anymore. Vosne Romani is not Vosne Romani anymore. Musigny is not Musigny anymore. What the hell is going on? And how do we define something that's changing so rapidly? Oregon used to hate the fact that California, that the currency of our wines was sunshine, and we got better scores than them. And now they're making big fleshy wines unapologetically, which doesn't surprise me, because most Oregonians don't like California because they're self-loathing ex-Californians that don't want to admit that they used to live in Culver City. that's all well and good. You know, Oregon is Oregon. I love Oregon. I wish they would love California as much as we love them. But there's change afoot, and there's change in consumer. We can talk a little bit about new drinkers coming in. One thing before I turn it back over to Adam, he can talk a little bit about consumer habits and climate change from his perspective. Is good news that between 2005 and 2023, we have doubled the amount of wine an average American drinks. So in the last 18 years or about 20 years, we've doubled our consumption of wine. So, you know, maybe we've dropped just a touch, maybe, you know, the peak and then it kind of came down a little bit. But hey, you know, in less than 20 years, doubling the consumption of wine. I mean, and if you look all the way back, you know, into 1934, we have increased wine consumption in this country tenfold, you know, since between World War I and World War II. So, I mean, from your perspective, Adam, you know, where are we? I mean, are
Well, I
you?
remember 1934, but not, but I think one does need to sometimes take those steps back, a couple of steps back, and look at things and see that there is this overall positive trend towards certain things. But there are some dips, and we did not have those dips before. So I think we are for the last 2 or 3 years down in per capita consumption. And Wes, what you were talking about, we really didn't have during this 20 plus years. Almost every year was up. Some of them larger, some of them smaller, but there was a continual upswing there and, until just recently. And I think it's freaking everybody out a little bit. But I do think you can still look at that overall trend and take a couple steps back and say it is better. On the climate change thing, one of the things that I have come to believe, and you mentioned Oregon pretty strongly there, I think that our true coastal areas are well set for the future. That when you look at Burgundy, it is much more of a continental climate. You look at Oregon, it's not quite continental like Burgundy is. It's not quite coastal like the areas of California are, except maybe the Van Duzer corridor has that opening to the ocean. But our area is the true Sonoma coast. Santa Lucia Highlands, part of Santa Cruz Mountains, San Luis Obispo, which I think is perhaps underrated and should be looked at more with future plannings, and Santa Rita Hills, Santa Maria Valley. I think those areas are actually staying fairly cool. And while other areas, like you mentioned, places in Burgundy, you know, Moussigny and areas that have changed dramatically, I don't see that we are changing as quickly in our areas because of the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, no, it's 70 degrees right here, right now, you know, in the middle of the Santa Maria Valley AVA, if not the southern part. Santa Rita Hills, all the areas that really have those open corridors to the Pacific Ocean, which rarely gets over 54 degrees. We've got that built-in air conditioning. I like to say every great story has tension, and the tension is ongoing, and the tension actually increases monumentally as it gets hotter out in the Central Valley. So, you know, today in Fresno, maybe 107 degrees, you know, out in Lompoc, you know, 68, 70, 75 in Santa Maria Valley. As you know, it gets hotter out in the Central Coast. The diurnal shift and the diurnal effect is starting to pull cold air off the Pacific Ocean to give us that protection. So I have seen, I mean, we definitely had some drought years and some hot years, but I would say 22, 23, it didn't hit 90 degrees in the Santa Maria Valley, period. I mean, maybe twice and maybe barely. So fortunately, some of these coastal communities, Santa Rita Hills, Santa Maria Valley, what you call the true Sonoma coast, which I like, some of those areas up north, and definitely the hypercoastal areas, are going to actually be well suited to continue to make the style of wine that we're used to seeing out of those regions, and really getting the QPR out of those California wines that still are some of the best in the world.
And I do agree on that. Do you worry about and you mentioned drought. So it is true from a temperature point of view. I think we're well suited for that. I do think occasionally we are seeing some bigger periods of drought or bigger things like that. not so much the temperature doesn't concern me, but it's more issues of rain and the like that is more concerning. And that when we do have, I mean, some year there's going to be again a 2011, we're going to have a big rain at the end of harvest, and sometimes the things that do happen are bigger than they were before.
Yeah, and I mean, we've had, give me a second just to feel calm after 2 years of 20 inches plus in the Santa Rita Hills and Santa Maria Valley. We haven't had that in 38 years. So we've finally had our rain. So I'm just going to say our soil profile was actually recharged last year. The salts have gone. I mean, obviously irrigation water adds salts to the soil profile, which slows down the vines. Grapes do not like to have salt crusted on their root systems. And after 4 or 5 years of drought, it becomes fairly intense and definitely impacts the physiology of the vine. But if you get 20 inches of rainfall, especially in sandy soil, those salts are melted and gone. So we have some very happy, healthy vines right now here in Santa Barbara County. And I want to just take this moment to relax and not even think about the D word, the drought
Yeah.
word, at least for a couple of years after a 25-inch rain and a 30-inch rain in 22 and 23. And we're only less than 50% veraison in Pinot Noir in Santa Maria Valley right now. So it looks like we're going to be mid-September before we start bringing in grapes, at least probably. I mean, we're going to get the Labor Day heat spike, which we always do. But it's obviously long, cool growing season punctuated by those September and October heat spikes is probably the way you can define almost any coastal region here in California that grows good Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
Down in Santa Barbara there, what I mean, we are very paranoid about fires up here, given what we went through. Is that something that y'all think about as much down there?
Yeah, we just obviously had the big fire. Fortunately, well, it's not so fortunate for the folks over near Happy Canyon and some of the places in eastern San Ynez Valley. But there is a new research that shows pre-veraison that smoke taint doesn't really take. It takes until bunch closure and basically the end of lag phase for basically the grapes to stretch their skins. And if the smoke taint hits the grapes before bunch closure, before veraison, there's not as much danger of smoke taint because Cal Fire is the most professional firefighting, force in the planet Earth. And the fact what they did to help that fire, it took a little while, and I heard the planes going over our head, 25 times a day. But we may have dodged a bullet because of the timing of these fires. If the fires hit right now, we would be absolutely screwed because the grapes have stretched. The grapes have basically gotten to the point when the bunch is closing, it can trap ash and other things to give those flavors. So so far with the fires we had earlier in the year, I'm not hearing a lot of talk about smoke taint, but in a sense where selling tons of fruit is not easy, it's not surprising I'm not hearing stories about smoke taint.
Yeah, I worry.
It was, sorry, Adam, before we, not sure where you were going, but we had a question from Bill Hargrove asking about the rain that we had and if it will also boost production and what exacerbates the problem.
If it could exacerbate the oversupply problem.
Mhm.
We are seeing pretty decent yields, but we did have a little bit of shatter. So I'm seeing clusters that are probably 20% less weight. So we're going to probably get 7-8 clusters per pound up here. So as far as if we would have had perfect flowering and set, I think we would have been seeing yields between 2.5 to 5 tons per acre in Pinot Noir, which is a lot for us. We could see another year like 17 or 2007. I think because of the cluster weights, we're going to see yields coming in the 2 to 3 ton per acre range, which to me is absolutely optimum. So the rain has made for healthy vines, some healthy clusters, some healthy growth. But I'm not hearing a lot of horror stories about where am I going to get rid of my Santa Maria Valley Chardonnay or Pinot Noir or Santa Rita Hills. I think most of those varieties and AVAs are still highly sought after. I'm sure there might be some vineyards that are struggling to sell some fruit, bigger vineyards. But I think we're in a very moderate yield cycle right now. So I'm not really seeing that to be a problem, Bill.
So interesting in Santa Lucia, and then here in Sonoma County, Murray and I were just with Nicole Hitchcock from Jay earlier, and they have started picking for sparkling now.
Wow.
And they're down 10-15%, the vineyards they've picked. Hearing in the Central Valley from folks at Gallo that they are down in that same kind of range. But what we've seen is something different than you have. We had really good weather during flowering and set, so we have very tight, some kind of smaller but tight hand grenade-ish clusters with some weight on them, but our cluster numbers are down.
Okay.
So, but it's resulting in the same final yield totals that we are down a bit from normal. So that will help somewhat, but I still think it's going to mean there's more fruit out there than there are than there is demand for it right now, which kind of goes to something about like one of the questions was consumer behavior, and somebody I did see also ask about the federal government possibly saying people should drink less and how that is going to affect things.
Neo-prohibitionism.
Yeah.
Well, I think, obviously, when you are seeing the World Health Organization talking to people where, basically whatever they say is going to massively influence people's health over the next 15 or 20 years, I think it is both responsible and irresponsible to talk about how any amount of red wine is or any amount of wine or alcohol is unhealthy. I think Karen McNeil in today's LA Times article probably said it the best, that when the World Health Organization out of one side of their mouth were talking about how isolation and a lack of social connection is one of the most devastating mental health problems in the world today, but we should not come together at table and have a glass of wine out of the other side of their mouth. I'm sorry, I'm just going to give them a big fat raspberry and say that wine is an investment to keep the people we love at table for an extra hour every day. And the people that hang around me for any given amount of time know that I say that at every winemaker dinner I've ever done, because it's true that table is holy. Table is the last meaningful ritual we have in this country. Table is my church. That's when I am able to connect to the people I love, to slow down, to push the pause button, to turn the phones off and to put them away. And can you do that without wine? I'm sure Mormon families and Muslim families all over the world have a great opportunity to sit at table without wine and have those same connections. But for me, thinking about finishing a bottle of wine and going to find something special out of the cellar to open up and to continue the conversation, that wine has that capacity and wine has that ability. So I think wine, you have to be able to connect how wine affects culture, how wine affects relationships, and how wine drives this conversation about getting together. And I also love, what Karen McNeil and Kimberly Charles are doing with this, come together October instead of dry October, get together October. Let's get back together at table and show the world that, coming together with wine is one of the most important things that we can do.
Well, and one of the things I actually have written a little bit about is the idea that if three of us go out to dinner and we order cocktails and we may each have a different cocktail, we will have our own appetizer and our own entree. The one thing that we share, well, we share the idea that we want to be there together, but we share the experience of that one bottle of wine that we have opened together. And that is the one shared experience. I know there's a lot of concern about young people not drinking as much. And I remember watching my son Truett, who's now 18 and going off to college tomorrow for the first time. But I remember him sitting there with a couple of friends, and they're on their phones playing a game. And I'm like, oh my God, they're not even communicating. They're not doing, but you know what they're doing? They are actually playing a game with each other. They are actually then playing with a friend who's away. And it gave me a little bit of hope that although it seems like they are really isolated from one another, they've understood that something, in that case, a video game, has brought them together, that at some point they could discover that something like a bottle or two of wine could bring them together as well.
And I'll tell you exactly the moment it'll happen when they realize that they're hopelessly never going to own a home, when they're hopelessly never going to get a six-figure job. They're going to say, fuck it, bring me a bottle. So maybe eventually just the economic reality of what, a lot of these younger people are going to be facing, trying to live the same life as their parents or their grandparents, might drive them to drink. And maybe then we'll start seeing a little of an uptick. And, I was one of those strange kids that I was given my first taste of, first growth Bordeaux when I was 9. It was the first wine I ever put in my mouth. And
which one was it? What was the first growth?
70, it was an off vintage. It was like a 73 Lafite.
Okay.
And believe it or not, it was Steve Pepe who gave it to me when I was doing dishes to make $5 so I could go play asteroids in Long Beach down at the 7-Eleven. So I was washing and polishing wine glasses, and he came up and he said something, only a Jersey guy would. Like, well, if you're old enough to polish wine glasses, you're old enough for a sip of 73 Latour or 73 Lafite. I'm not saying that a 9-year-old should be drinking, but my wife didn't finish her wine, and something of this quality shouldn't go down the drain. So my brother took a sip, I took a sip. He said, ooh, I said, whoa. And that's the difference between me and my brother. Now he's a venture capitalist, and I basically am in the wine industry, for all the delicious booze and the good conversations. But that's it. You have to have a family that gives you the proper modeling of how wine should be consumed. A lot of kids, I think, might be coming out of situations where, their parents might have drank too much or too little, or they recognize that, problems with alcohol and drugs can lead to, poor health outcomes. But I grew up in a family where, in family get-togethers with my grandparents, we never drank because my grandparents were Presbyterian ministers and teetotalers. So I had that interesting dichotomy of when my mom would bring her lawyer friends over, they would drink great wine, but I never saw alcohol at a table at a larger family gathering until I was maybe 30. So it's all about balance. It's all about, juggling. It's all about finding what keeps us happy, can keep us healthy. I like to think, Robert Mondavi lived into his early 90s, and I've heard stories about the amount of wine he would drink at lunch and dinner. He was what I like to call a core consumer. And it seems like for the people that can handle their liquor and that are careful in the way they drink and make sure they get enough water and enough nutrients and enough vitamins, that even a fair amount of drinking, a level of drinking that the World Health Organization would say was unhealthy, can be extraordinarily healthy, and these people can live long, beautiful, healthy lifestyles. We just have to be careful. We have to listen to each other, and we have to be careful.
Did you ever have a chance to meet Robert Mondavi?
I did not.
I did twice. And one time I got invited to an event. I was working at Binziger, and I thought the Mondavi Winery was promoting this huge wine tasting over in Europe. And the Binziger said, Adam, you go. And I was very unimportant at Binziger. And so they sent me, and I figured it's going to be a room of 250 people. And I get there, and it's at a round table with 20 people at the table. Doug Schaefer, John Williams from Frog's Leap, one of the Trefethans, and I was seated between Robert Mondavi and his wife, and I am scared shitless. Like, beyond, I will not talk, I won't say anything, and it's a 3-course lunch talking about this, and I'm saying nothing. And at some point, the discussion moves towards selling wine on this new thing called the internet. And I've had a little bit to drink, and I drank. I eventually raised my hand, and I'm like, and I told them what I knew about the internet. I probably even told them about you and the Prodigy Wine Bulletin Board. And then people, oh, well, thank you very much, Adam. And then the discussion moved on, and all of a sudden I feel this hand on my shoulder pulling me towards him, and it's Robert Mondavi, and he looked at me and talked just directly to me and said, Adam, I do not know about this thing called the internet. Tell me what you know. And so he and I spent like 5 minutes talking. But to me, the most important thing that I learned from that is, here is a man in his little finger that would know more about selling wine than I will ever know. And he began a conversation with some young kid saying, I do not know.
Mm.
Tell me. And that was amazing to me.
That's Confucius, right? To admit ignorance is wise.
Yeah.
And to say you're not ignorant is ignorance.
I do think we are missing someone like a Mondavi who was out promoting certainly his own wine, but promoting wine drinking as a whole. We're missing that kind of figure in the wine world.
Remember his phrase on the back of the bottle that always struck me and was kind of like the very beginning of me understanding that wine is not a beverage, it's a culture, and it's a culture that connects us to antiquity. Wine has been consumed, alcohol has been consumed. I mean, alcohol has been around. It was the first energy producing molecular bond change in history. It's hundreds, if not, it's billions of years old. It's not like when did mankind invent alcohol? It's more like when did alcohol invent mankind? And so this idea of connecting us to the ancient thing, that's why one reason why I get a lot of wine dinners and a lot of wine conferences is because I do this history of wine thing. It's sort of like a TED talk. I can do it in 5 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, 90 minutes, what have you. But the idea of good wine education is to connect us with the ancient, to make us feel connected, and to say that if our enslaved, ignorant ancestors 10,000 years ago could know that we could drink wine from 100 different countries any given day, damn it, they would. And we owe it to our ancestors to get out and try all of these delicious wines. For God's sake, 1.1 million individual bottles of wine are produced in the world today. I did the math. To taste 90% of all wines in the world produced, you would have to drink a wine every 23 seconds without break, 24/7, 365. And you would die, but you would actually taste 90% of the wines that were consumed in the world that year. So the greatest thing about wine, by virtue of the way things are, it is subjective. Is wine one of the last things we can be subjective about?
Well, maybe, but I guess that would be a question too of we grew up in a time, wine-wise, in a time where reviews, ratings in particular, sold a lot of wine, introduced a lot of people to wine. And I know there is a lot of thought that, oh, the Parkerization of wine or this or that. And I don't know. It had negatives, no doubt, that so much power was put in the hands of a very few, but it also worked at the time.
Yep. No, and I always say, Robert Parker is one of the two most important Roberts who ever walked the world in the world of wine, Robert Parker and Robert Mondavi. Mm-hmm. Mondavi giving us the gracious life, right? That those two words at the bottom, back of the bottle that I was trying to get to, then I went off on a tangent. The gracious life. That's what I want to be. I want to be in the gracious life, right? And then Robert Parker got more people drinking fine wine than probably anybody in the history of the world, besides maybe like Pliny and Columella in the ancient Roman Empire.
Yeah.
I mean, so Robert Parker and I don't agree on style, but he is an American wine hero because I recognize what he did. Even my first Pinot Noir, 2000 Clos Pepe Estate, he gave it this glowing review and gave it an 89 plus, which was like, who the hell are you and why are you making decent wine, right? So that was back in like 01, 02, I think, where you really had to kind of kiss the ring a little bit. And you had to have, in a single blind world, as we know how Parker tastes.
Kiss the Ring was about 2 feet higher than you really needed to do to get the high rating, Wes. But
yeah, well, fortunately, it'll take more than that to get me. But yeah. Anyways, but he was when I met him, he was a very interesting fellow. The thing that struck me is just how physically large, his head was. I couldn't stop thinking. I met him the first time and shook his hand and thanked him for all he did with wine. As I walked away, all I could think was like, oh my God, John Madden has nothing on this guy. Not to say inflated ego or anything. I mean, I give Robert Parker I have no wines anymore that we submit to him, so I have no reason to be nice to him, but he is an American wine hero from my perspective.
Well, I do think, though, it's interesting to me that we have gotten away from a time of critics, and we could step away briefly from wine, but we used to go to movies, because two guys we didn't know in Chicago would tell us, hear, yeah, two thumbs up kind of thing. Frank Prile would tell us what restaurants to go to. I mean, you would listen to that, and now we've gotten to a point where it is more crowd recommended type thing. You hear from friends what movies to go to, and it's harder in that world to gain attention than it used to be. And that maybe that's an individual winery thing, not wine as a whole, but it has made it more challenging in some ways.
I think now, and I want you to talk about, because one thing I think that's bullshit in the wine industry is this idea, that culture doesn't matter. And that what I think you've done at Clarice, and I would like for you to talk a little bit about that, because I've been trying to learn from your success and a lot of the people saying that Clarice is one of the kind of new ideas of what a wine culture can be. That I don't want to be a part of a brand. I want to be a part of a culture. So maybe you could walk us through, your movement from Siduri through Clarice and why you set up what you did at Clarice, and maybe define a little bit of what you did there.
Yeah, I mean, what I was trying to do when I sold Siduri, I wanted to get back to smaller, hands-on making of wine, and that was just me personally, and that was certainly the case. I kind of felt like the winery was running me rather than running the winery. I do think that what Clarice was meant to do was to try to recapture something we used to do. Do you remember? I mean, Brian Loring would do the Pizzoni parties where there would be a bunch of people that would get together there. We would get together and we would taste other people's wine. We'd go to the Hitching Post. We'd go to places, and it was more about promoting wine as a whole. And with Clarice's production now, 4 acres worth of fruit, 500 to 700, that's probably more than I've ever made, but 500 to 650 cases. I don't feel like, I mean, people that are going to want that wine are going to buy it, but then I need to introduce people to other things about wine, to other experiences, to other people's wines. And it can be anything you're into. I want to introduce them to people, though, that I think are good people as well, and people that I know personally, and that I think the wines are quality. So, I mean, anything that someone like you is involved with, and us doing this together, I mean, we're talking about wine as a whole. We're not really out here necessarily promoting one another's wine, and it wouldn't be hard to do with James Ontiveros, who I've known over the years very well, or even plenty of people who don't make Pinot, God forbid, but there are other grapes out there. And, my gosh, this is a really good guy who's making a really small amount of Cabernet, and I love that. And let's talk about that person. I think there is something there that we have lost over time when we have struggled so much sometimes to sell our own wine. We worry so much about shelf space that we have lost track of the idea that we need more people drinking more good wine. And eventually they will find our wine and make that work or not, but we just really need to expand the base somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I like to say that, my focus is, I mean, I get paid on points of distribution, which we call pods. I mean, this is another kind of like inside outside. When you work for a wine distributor or you're a salesperson, you get paid every time you put something on a shelf or on a list or buy the glass. And we call that a pod, a point of distribution. So if I bring 3 wines into a restaurant, that's 3 pods. If I put 2 wines on a shelf, that's 2 pods. And we get so tied up in pods and numbers that we forget sometimes that what the consumers want is a deeper dive into what we do, an idea of how wine is produced, how wine is grown. And if you can give people a little bit of insight from from the way we understand wine from the inside, because wine is not hard to love. The idea of wine and the stories of wine are innumerable. I mean, we could sit here, and tell stories about Andrei Telechev. We could sit here and tell more stories about Robert Mondavi. I've got a great story about Aubert de Villaine. I mean, on and on and on. There are personalities and cultural moments that define who we are in the wine business. And what I'm looking at right now personally, even though I love my work here at Native 9 and, the fact that James Ontiveros' family has been in the business for 243 years. He's been growing grapes and ranching in California since 1781. That is a story that keeps me involved in this brand because I want the world to know his story. So that helps me stay within a brand, even so I can tell these stories. But I think the magic of how I like to operate is to tell stories that don't sell wine, that sell the idea of wine.
Yep.
And I'm not saying the rest of the wine world needs to fricking get on board, but the rest of the world needs to get on board. We need to start building this culture of what it means to be at table, what it means to be with friends and family with an open bottle of wine, to understand that this is our culture and we're not going to give it up to the World Health Organization. We're not going to give it up because someone says what we're doing is somehow not healthy. We know that, you know, careful wine consumption with the people that we love has an incredibly meaningful effect on our life. We know that we're putting in that 12th hour, the idea that this weekend we're going to go to a tasting room and taste a bunch of Grenaches we've never tasted before. This drives our imagination. This drives our will to live. And I refuse to live in a world that does not celebrate wine. Wine is the most important fermented beverage on the planet, and you cannot separate the history of humanism, the history of culture, the history of Western culture, even North, you know, there was a defined wine culture in North Africa before the grapes had ever gone over the Alps with Julius Caesar. So this is not purely, you know, a Western European culture. This is a Middle Eastern culture. This is a Near Eastern culture. This is a culture that even got into China as the first, you know, authenticated, you know, fermented beverage ever discovered was 9600 BCE in China. So, I mean, obviously, this is something that brings us together as a world, and I refuse to be in a world without wine.
So how do you feel, and this is something we briefly discussed on, so we said this was going to be an unplanned conversation, but to be truly fair, Wes and I did talk a little bit beforehand about a couple of things. There is a movement now towards wines like Meiomi, very sweet. Caymus Cab, very different than it used to be, sweet. I certainly got into wine because of White Zinfandel. I mean, that was a beginning, and it made a difference to me. So I can see how some of those wines can be door openers for people. It's hard for me to believe that Caymus Cabernet at $70, $80 is a door opener for people with wine because of the price point. Oh, I mean, I'm not saying style not without. I mean, I didn't have the ability to do $70 bottles, even the equivalent of that back in the day. So that's the problem that you could get into there. But that style, is that something that we should be encouraging more? We should be discouraging? We should, what do you think?
I'm about to make a sort of an admission that may help me lose 10% of my wine geek cred. And that is almost once a month, I drink a glass of white zin with a spicy tuna roll at my local sushi joint. I think it's a beautiful match. I get it with a little extra sriracha and that little bit of residual sugar balance the capsaicin beautifully. 40% of people who start to drink wine are only drinking wine because it's sweet. Stella Rosa is not sucking wind. You know, I mean, off-dry wines are not sucking wind. The idea that you need to jump in and be able to, it's like, you know, I don't expect people the first time they eat uni or the first time they have a raw oyster to say that's the most delicious thing I've ever had. Let's be honest, dry wine is an acquired taste. And once we understand it, it is one of the most important things in our life, right? But gosh, sweet wine is, you know, I was conceived because of a bottle of Mateus. I've been told this over and over and over. If Mateus was not available in 1968, I might not be here right now talking to you about why Mateus is not profane. Lancers, you know, it's not just a bottle of wine, but it's a candle holder for after dinner, right? So we got to remember that core consumers start off as people that have normal human taste buds. And when you taste something sweet, that tells your body you're getting energy. It's a positive physiological response. It's not because they don't understand wine. It's because they are descended from frugivores 8 million years ago, were Australopithecus afarensis, wandering looking for fruit on the Olduvai Gorge and in Africa. We are still frugivores. If you tell your intern to go take a field sample from Gary's and you don't tell them how to do the fruit sample, it'll come back 4 bricks higher than it's normal, because the human discernment goes for ripe. We look for red, we look for black, we look for sweet, we look for big flavors. Americans were born with 3 flavors in their genetics: Big Mac, milkshake, French fry. Mayomi, Big Mac, milkshake, French fry.
So, no, but see, I will disagree with you only in the categorization of it. I don't have any problem with sweet wine at all, or sweeter wines, but you talk about White Zin or you talk about Matus, they were not presenting themselves as anything other than a different category of wine. And I think right now there is some confusion in that, with German wines, you have Trocken and Halbtrocken, half dry, dry and half dry wines. You are having Pinot Noirs that are presented alongside Pinot Noirs that are dry, that aren't dry. And so I wonder about that categorization, can't even say it right, of wine, and that mixing those together, if that doesn't create some confusion.
Well, wasn't the Riesling Federation now trying to put basically dry, like the level of sweetness, level of acidity and body, as a chart instead of a classification? Because not everyone can say truck and beer and house, they say. So obviously, I think whatever we can do. I think the idea of demystifying wine was 10 years ago, and we had that, let's make wine simple and everything. I don't know, maybe wine doesn't need to be simple, but where do we go? How can we make it accessible? I mean, I think accessibility is a beautiful word, both for the disability community as well as the able-bodied community. So, I mean, we could actually look at this. My wife is a disability advocate. She's in a wheelchair, and she's trying to teach the world to make sure that they know that, one big step entering their business is a non-starter for us. So that one step to someone in a wheelchair might be the idea that someone looking at the inscrutable wall of wine at a grocery store, you're probably the same way, Adam. Like when I see someone struggling in a grocery store, I don't work there, but I stop and make sure they find a badass bottle of wine.
Of course, yeah.
Their fucking world.
Yeah.
That's what I want to do. So how do we do that as an industry? How do we hold hands and, find people the wines that they love? Because everyone in this group knows, like, this is an insular discussion that might be semi sort of almost masturbatory in the sense of what we want to do in the greater world. We are all in agreement that we need to find a way to turn people on to the wines that they love. And once, the way I look at it was a great quote by William Butler Yeats, which I used to hang up in my classroom when I taught English. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. So how do we light the fire? How do we get people passionate about wine?
Do you think so? A couple of people here have mentioned TikTok, and I must confess I have been really bad about that, but that is a medium that is younger people oriented. Is that something? And I don't know many wineries that are doing much on there. I know a lot of people that are doing social media stuff, but I don't know of a large TikTok following or wine effort there.
Yeah, like the one TikTok guy, the one wine TikTok guy, I think that has the most followers. He works in a winery and like films himself overfilling a barrel and like 10, 15 gallons of wine splashing all over him. So he's completely covered. It's a different vibe. But don't underestimate the TikTok audience. I mean, as far as them being able to direct you towards the things that you're passionate about, they know where your eyes are. They know what you're looking at. They know what you're talking about. My wife and I do things where we'll talk about Jamaica for 2 days, and then all of a sudden, all of our social media starts talking about Jamaica. It's frightening. But, like we don't really worry too much anymore because there's, since the last 5 years in California, legal history, we don't do anything that's illegal anymore. So we don't really care about the cops showing up. We're very basic people. We enjoy, some forms of intoxicants that are perfectly legal in the state of California. But as far as like people knowing our business, we're starting to decide we are actually a little bit comfortable with social media feeding us all the passions of what we love. But I think you're right that fine wine has failed to capture that TikTok audience.
And the bugaboo also that we really haven't talked about is price,
Mm.
which is something that is difficult. I mean, you and I could go to the bar up the street here and we could have a glass, a taste of their best tequila, their best. I mean, we could do Louis Trey if we wanted to go crazy. But on wine, we're constrained to these 6 or 8 choices they have, many cases of which they are fairly mediocre within a very limited price range. And wine does not last like spirits do.
Yeah. So may I suggest I bring up the sort of Australian formula, which is basically whatever you pay for a ton of fruit. Let's say Pinot Noir on average in coastal regions, let's say 3,000 to 4,000 a ton. Is that accurate?
3,500 I was going to go with, so perfect.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
right
3,500 a ton. If you take 1% of the ton cost, you should be at your bottle cost, because that integrates your rent, your equipment, your water, your chemicals, and everything. So if you pay 3,500 for a ton of Pinot Noir, the average cost of a coastal Pinot Noir in California right now should be 35, and we know a lot of times it's not.
Well, but wait. You can't jump off of this too quickly, because that's your average price that you should be getting, but you're going to sell a percentage of that to distributors at 17.
Right, or 15,
Right. So
what
then does the rest have to be 50 or 60, or what dollar number does that have to be to get to that number you're at?
we love to protect and keep quiet how wine is priced.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about, let's use a $50 bottle of Pinot, which is today not nearly what it was 10 years ago. If you're selling a $50 bottle of Pinot Noir retail, what are you selling it to the distributor free on board, FOB?
Around $22.
$22. So we get $22 back. I like to say when I do staff training to waiters, that a waiter or a sommelier properly tipped will make more money on the sale of a bottle of wine than anyone in the supply chain. A server will make more money on a bottle of wine on the tip than the grower made, than the winemaker, than the owner, than the distributor, the driver, the broker. In the end, that it's actually the server that can end up making more money on a bottle of wine ever. So a $50 bottle of wine is $22, but you spent $5,000 on that ton of fruit. How do you make wine profitable on 650 cases?
Yeah, I mean, you have to sell like Clarice at $98 a bottle, and I give some discounts and cut out and include shipping in that, because people hate to pay shipping, and Amazon screwed us on that, because they're able to do that, although that's not even working that well for them anymore. But you have to find a way to sell a large percentage of it direct to make it worthwhile.
If we saw a federal law or the Supreme Court full pause, decide that that Americans should be able to sell other Americans wine. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, if he knew that about the 3-tier distribution system and the fact that in California, I can't send a bottle of American wine to another American, I think he'd flip in his grave. And I think he would be insanely pissed off. He would be very proud of every American that has made wines that have brought us up to sort of the reputation of world class. The fact that delicious Merlot is being actually produced now in Monticello, Virginia. In the end, if you could sell wine to all 50 states, how would that influence your business?
Oh, I mean, it would be huge. It would help tremendously, no doubt. John, you mentioned the distribution system is broke. It is, but it's also broke to the detriment of the entire wine business. So even though the distributors or the waiters might be making money off of the tip there, or the distributors, at least the distributors most of the time have a set figure that they know they're marking it up. With the wine business, your costs can go up and down based on a lot of different factors. If they made some decisions and wineries made some decisions, larger ones, and said, we're going to cut margins a little bit on one of our wines, we're going to increase them on others, but to get the wine out there so that more people could drink wine, and distributors would go along with that, and we could do something in each case to work to try to promote, again, an interesting, unique, different wine out there for a very fair price. I think that would help. I think right now restaurants, I mean, we mentioned it earlier, there is this sea of wine out there. People would give up a lot of margin to get their brand out in the hands of people by the glass. So I think restaurateurs need to look and say, I don't need to just buy from this bigger distributor or this bigger winery. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with those either, but I can change around my wines by the glass and get some really interesting things and unique things in the hands of people, rather than something that's fairly generic and very just, a good price, but no real character to it.
And I mean, pricing and character are two different things. And generally, I don't look for a lot of character in a by the glass selection, but I look for quality, cleanliness, expressiveness, and something delicious that before I know it, the glass is empty. Could every fine dining restaurant, I mean, we can't really talk about, probably Michelin stars and Bib Gourmands and that sort of stuff. But I like to say that every restaurant in the United States that serves wine should have a $10 bubbles, $10 white, and a $10 red. Is that doable in the current wine market?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably have a $10. You could certainly have a $12. I think that's doable. But
Yeah.
maybe 10 could be doable. I also think you need to price certain things. You need to have some bottles out there that are interesting at 50, $60. You need to have, so it's a real price. But on this wine you took, I mean, there was loss leader was mentioned. It's not even really a loss. It's just you're not making as much money. So it's, you could do that in a restaurant and say, these are the wines that we are promoting this week, this month. Maybe a month's a better amount of time for them to really go through it, and have some things there that are featured, and invite James Ontiveros, invite Adam Lee, Ray Breland to say, hey, we're going to submit some wines for this month-long program because we got something interesting and we want to get our name out there.
If we're kind of looking an hour into this conversation to say, where the bullshit lies in the industry, what have we missed that is the big glowing, sort of bollocks rolling downhill towards all of us in the wine industry? Is there something that we've neglected to really look at, to think what is not only, I think what we've been talking about, what are the barriers to connect customers and wine, right? Because that's what we think about, because when we wake up in the morning, we look at the warehouse, we see the cases there, and we like those cases to go to forever homes like well-bred puppies. We want them to love them and to raise them, and then to open them at the right moment and to pour. And it's just, it feels like love and a puppy sort of kissing your cheek. Where's the bullshit that we haven't covered? And you're more than welcome, everyone, to put something in chat if there's something that you think that we're missing.
I think what we've missed are the people, the stories, that aspect of it is what people truly relate to. People try that. They try with Jim Beam because probably there was a story, or Jack Daniels, there was a story then, but there is no longer. But there are still real stories with people that make wine, that are farmers, that they farm the ground and they make the wine, and their grandfather bought the land, or James Hunter-Veris's family, I don't know, it's 1780 or whatever you said. That's like not father or grandfather, that's many, many generations. But these people, I wrote up something today and to a wine writer who had a question, and I'm like, these lands in the Santa Lucia Highlands are farmed sustainably, and sustainably is not a catchword. It's not a marketing phrase. It's not anything. Sustainably means they're farming it because they want, and taking care of it because they want their grandkids to be able to run around on that land and play there and raise grapes themselves there. And that's sustainably. That's what sustainable means. It's going to be around for a long time. That's a really real definition of sustainability.
Do you think, I mean, the way I think about it is a lot of people drink wine instead of beer or spirits or cocktails because there's a certain history and authenticity to wine.
Yeah.
Are we talking about, I mean, the idea that if you can have a brand and you can have a back label that ties people to a time and a place, because we all know that, you know, I took the tasting room management class at UC Davis with Craig Root, Dr. Craig Root. And one thing that he always said that blew me away, if you have a tasting room that looks out a window and there's a window on a vineyard and people can see where the grapes are grown that are in your glass at the tasting room, your sales per customer go up 63% over a wine tasting room that's in a city or in a mall that is, so to me, 63% screams that people are just absolutely thirsty for authenticity. That in a world where things are plastic, where things are manufactured, where the internet hears what you love and tries to give you something, you know, from a cheap platform, that the process of going out and finding a wine that you love and being told about it and being connected to it, it's the last way that we can sort of stick our feet in the dirt and feel that we are actually human beings living on a planet spinning 70,000 miles an hour through space. And I don't, how do you give that? Is that message only available to wines that are truly authentic? I'd like to argue that our brands, Clarice and Native 9, are truly authentic.
Mm-hmm.
But we also know that what Gallo and, you know, the lovely people at Jackson Family, and I say that with great respect because I have lots of friends in both families. They've got people out there trying to take their brands and give them an authenticity through a marketing program. How do brands that have true authenticity connect with brands that are trying to establish authenticity so we can all get along and be telling a true story?
Sure. And I do think it's fascinating. The two brands that you mentioned, the Gallows and the Jacksons, both are truly family owned. So there are Gallows and there are people there, individuals there that are truly, you can call up Barbara Banke or you can write Barbara Banke or Joe Gallo or whatever. And I think that's interesting. I think that's, they are bigger. There's definitely huge marketing arms. Things have changed and I get all of that. But deep at the core there, this is not a publicly traded company. This is not, those are different. To me, I make a small, or at least somewhat of a differentiation at that level. I think one of the interesting things that I still look at from the time after selling Siduri to Jackson Family, and this sounds weird, and it is, but it's very authentic. As far as Zinfandel goes, Jackson has Hartford make a little bit, Murphy Good makes a little bit. Not really any other companies make Zinfandel. Why not? Because Jess Jackson really dislikes Zinfandel, and Barbara likes it a little more than Jess did, but not much more. So you know why they don't make it? Because she didn't like it. That's a pretty authentic reason, at least. I mean, it feels real to me. Why would you make something you don't like?
Yeah, and you have to bring what you make into the market with passion.
But I almost think you need to share that. You almost need to share with people, hey, we don't do it because we don't really care for it that much. Good enough. Great.
That's a pretty amazingly authentic story too. And I think, you know, obviously the human brain, sort of from the science that I've read, cannot understand a concept without a proxy or without a symbol. So we can't understand freedom without imagining an eagle flying through the sky. You know, we can't understand it. So I think pontificating, which, you know, pontiff, the bridge, that's why the Pope is called the pontiff, because he bridges heaven and earth. We have to pontificate. And it sounds like something we don't want to hear, but pontificating to me is to build the bridge between knowledge and ignorance, to say, if you don't understand wine, I'm going to take it on my shoulders to try to teach as many Americans that wine is a precious, historic, and wonderful thing that connects us to the past, connects us to flavor, and is the ultimate vehicle for showing off place. And part of that is what we're doing. But then the problem is storytelling is both authentic and bullshit, right?
Sure.
So how do you separate the wheat from the chaff?
I don't know that you necessarily have to. It depends on how much bullshit there is involved in it. If there's, I mean, I can't promise you, certainly after a good number of, I mean, I can tell you great stories after a good number of wine dinners, that the gist of the story is true. Are all the exact details necessarily true? I am not, there might have been one or two that were lost in the faded memory of a bottle of port at the end. That can create issues. But I think you need to genuinely be, what you said, authentic, more than like to be hung up on complete and total accuracy in my mind. And I know that's kind of like maybe wimping out a little bit. But what if I screwed up and said, no, it wasn't the 85 Chateau Margaux I took that one time, it was the 86? Well, I don't think that really makes that much of a difference.
I had I'm seeing that Bill Hargrove asked a good question as well about less obvious regions and
Yeah.
how they're kind of, Finger Lakes, Virginia, Michigan, three places that I've been recently to do education as well as national conferences for Winemaker Magazine. I found the Finger Lakes to be absolutely fascinating. I love wines with high acidity, and Finger Lakes has more acid in those wines than a Dead Show parking lot. Seriously amazing wines out there. Virginia, what they're doing with Cab Franc, what they're doing, I think, with Norton, what they're doing with Viognier is extraordinary. And Michigan, some of the sparkling wines that are coming out of the UP, I think, are special too. Are there places, as we look at like California, Oregon, Washington, are the only places to pay attention to? I mean, you've got history in Texas. You want to speak to Hill Country?
Texas and the Hill Country is doing remarkably well as far as wineries growing. Quite frankly, the ease of business there is a thing. And you're seeing much more interest from California wineries being involved in Texas, in the Texas wine business right now. I think figuring out the grapes that grow well consistently is something that they have learned over the last decade, 15 years. And there's some positive things occurring in lots of different parts of the country. And when you can go in and the cost of your acre is $3,500, it's easier to plant and make some money out of it than it is when you are at $35,000 an acre in the San Lucia Highlands, which is pretty cheap right now for SLH land, but that's what it's down to. But I mean, 3,500 versus 35,000, you can do pretty well.
Right on.
Yeah.
Should we perhaps sort of
Yeah.
look at the little document that I put together and sort of.
We should, but we also only have about 10 minutes left in our time on my Zoom now. And so if we looked at what you put together here, you had some good news and some bad news about wine consumption.
Right. And I don't need to, going through this quickly. We talked about basically we've doubled consumption since 2005. The average cost of a US bottle of wine is currently $14. This was a really interesting one that 55% of all wine consumers are women. And generally, I think their economic input, as far as especially being sort of the purse strings, which wine clubs the family's going to join, which wines the family's going to cellar, I think has become much, much, much more important to people that lack a Y chromosome. And then, of course, I love this idea. Just barely half of all wine consumed within the United States comes out of a 750 milliliter bottle. Almost 50% of wine consumed in the United States comes out of a jug or a box. Consumption peaked in 2021. Our consumption right now is equal to 2010, 2011 levels, which is hello sideways, which helped Pinot Noir but hurt Merlot. 1 in 3 all new wine consumers enter the category through sweet wine. So 30% of new wine consumers are all coming in through sweet. Also during COVID, sales of sweet wine increased by 40%. And then between 22 and 23, both on and off premise wine sales decreased slightly, but not at a level that is at all like sincerely worrying. Younger consumers of wine have decreased between 15 and 20, and then 40%. Only in 2015, 40% of Americans drank wine at least once a month. In 2021, that was down to 25%.
I mean, I think it's all really fascinating where we're going. One of the things, and I don't have a thing in front of me here, but in the last 3 years, the one great variety that is up, according to Nielsen scan surveys, both in dollars and in overall consumption, is Sauvignon Blanc.
Sauvignon B is going off. Sauvignon B just took over Pinot Grigio as the second most popular white varietal in the United States. And thank goodness, because I think Sauvignon Blanc has so much more character and interest in the palate and the nose. I think the idea that we're smelling interesting and wonderful wines instead of something as sort of neutral as Pinot Grigio, especially Pinot Grigio that's planted in the wrong types of places. I love the fact that Sauvignon Blanc is hitting on all cylinders right now. Absolutely. And it just makes me think, looking at all these statistics, where do we go to try to make sure that the wine industry, especially, in California specifically, that's where we make wine, is thriving? That it's interesting that two people like you and I are both fully representing wine brands, Native 9 and Clarice, that are under 1,000 cases total all-in production. We produce 250 cases of Chardonnay, 250 cases of Pinot Noir, 250 cases of Cabernet yearly. And that helps me sleep at night when I know that there's not 10, 15,000 cases, waiting for me to get into the market with a bag and try to move them.
Yeah.
Has that also kind of helped you kind of sleep at night?
No, I sleep like shit, but that's just my own issue. That is not anything else. It makes me feel very comfortable at the level that I am. What is encouraging to me right now, and maybe this is the good way to end, because we both kind of wanted to end on something positive, and I'll kind of lead it off. Murray and I have a very good friend, a guy named Grant Myers, who is planting new land in the Santa Lucia Highlands. He's planting that land because his family had the land. He believes that it's an amazing area. He has loved the community, and he feels like, I want to supply grapes to these people who I admire and the wine that they're making. Murray came in 2021 during these times of challenges and started making her own wine and started a new brand. And I have pushed her sometimes, saying, I didn't really have a plan at Siduri, and it kind of got out of hand for me and grew bigger. Now I just want to keep Clarice really small. How big do you want to get? Do you have a real business plan? And her answer, and it's probably the right answer at this size that she is, and as far as she's like, I want to be as big as it allows me to be out in my vineyard and doing the work out there, and no bigger than that. And if I can stay that size, whatever that number is, then that's fine. Those types of people, Grant, Murray, things like that, are encouraging to me, because they are, you and I have been doing this a long time, and I got a lot more grays, and you have grays that we didn't have when we met. And yet, there are new people that are coming along that are doing this, despite what we're saying, we're not attracting enough new people. Let's put some of this on them and say, hey, y'all are new. You tell your friends, this is a thing. This is exciting. You may not listen to the old guy, but listen to people that are closer in age to you and promote how incredible this time at table is. This time together, this is our table today in many ways. That's exciting.
Yeah, and very excited that everybody got to hopefully share a glass as we had this conversation. I asked myself, what would be a really positive message to end with? And of course, I'm a storyteller, so I'm going to tell you my story of meeting Oberto Villain at the California Club in, I guess this was 1998. And we were tasting the wines of from Wilson Daniels, of the Domaine de la Romani Conti, from Montrachet, all the way through all the Grand Crus and all of their wines. And I was a young winemaker, and these were the first time I had ever tasted that many Grand Crus. And because I was the grower, the California Club and Eric Moe, a great sommelier in LA who has passed since then, he put me next to Aubert de Villain. Aubert de Villain also was brilliant because he married a woman from Santa Barbara. I did too. So his English is wonderful. And so what he saw is every time the wine came out, I was filling pages of my notes. I'm drinking the Romani Saint Vivant, drinking the Montrachet, taking notes and notes and notes and notes. And he kept looking at me with a slight look of disappointment. And I didn't know why he was disappointed that I was taking his wine so seriously. So I got to the Latoche, and Latoche was getting the all verklempt, and it was delicious. I took 2 pages of notes. I was like writing a novel on the 95 Latoche. And then I got the Romani Conti in my glass, and I stuck my nose in it, and I just made this noise, and it was like, fuh. And that's what I wrote in my notes. Instead of writing a full, write-up of the 95 Romani Conti, DRC and Romani Conti, I just wrote across the page, FU ... And then I closed my book, and I put my nose back in the glass, and I just started vibing on the wine, right? And Aubert tapped me on the shoulder and whispered in my ear, "Monsieur, that's the first honest note you've taken all night." So
Yeah.
my favorite initiation into the deeper wisdom of Burgundy before I ever actually got to go to Burgundy was Aubert de Villain telling me to shut the fuck up and just put my nose in that glass and to try to understand from my heart what that wine was doing and shut off the brain a little bit. So maybe that's what we need to do, is lead with our heart. And sometimes, at least when we're drinking Burgundy, to leave the brain behind, because that's more of a Bordeaux thing. I'm not talking shit about Bordeaux. I'm just saying people that love Burgundy have a much, much bigger soul.
Well, Wes, thank you for joining this today or being part of this. I'm glad you and I talked about doing it. And it's a great way to kind of lead into harvest in the most exciting time of our year every year. I'm thrilled to kind of do this together. Thank you. And thank you, Murray, for hosting it.
Yes, absolutely. And any way I can ever be of any help to you, customers, anybody around, please stay in touch. Just weswines@gmail.com. Check out native9.com, where Justin Willett's making some of the best Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Cabernet in Santa Barbara County. Tiny little production. And if you come into Santa Barbara County, please do reach out to us at Native9. We'd love to put together a private tasting for you to show you a number of vintages of these delicious wines. So that was my, as Frank Zappa would say, that was my 30 seconds of strictly commercial.
Yeah. Well, cheers, everyone. Have a good evening. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for spending time.
Bye.
All right. Cheers.